Previously on Tales of Rogart, a proud gray-coated rodent awoke to the perils of the final push of the human kingdom to exterminate Mischief, the main settlement of the rat folk. A servant to the royal family, he was given the mission of collecting rations from the royal estate's main keep, where he met a young gray orphan, later named Burkhall, that hid within the royal pantry. Burkhall, on the brink of starvation, ate and sought shelter from the crossfire of the battle, which had already sacked the surrounding domiciles of the kingdom. He was offered employment, and happily accepted, once again having some kind of semblance of belonging in the world. The two of them managed to gather what food remained and join the royal family and the many nobles who had fled to the royal estate. After an encouraging speech from King Leonis, the very foundations of the castle began to collapse. A frenzied escape of many rodents left many dead under the fallen keep. They found themselves in a makeshift encampment, where they prepared for the journey to the sister township of Sorrel. Their arrival wasn't the most welcome, but they quickly assimilated with the society, the best any large influx of refugees could. The humans did not relent at the fall of Mischief, however, and soon were at the doorstep of Sorrel, demanding the royal family, along with other boons of war, such as crops. The elders of Sorrel and Leonis perturbed the king, offering only Leonis's own head. Unfortunately, much of the royal family turned into a brutal example of just how depraved their enemies truly were. Miska, the young daughter, by some miracle survived, and became a beacon of hope to her rodents. They weathered a winter of hardship, famine, and disease that rippled through the entire combined settlement's ranks. The time had finally come to prepare to move on, to stop burdening the township which had taken them. She bid that each of them learn as much as they could before they went to rebuild, and gave hope that one day they could return home. Tales of Rogart Part 2, A New Rat. After Lady Miska's speech, the royal servant clan met at order of Radsum, the head of the house. Henceforth, Lady Miska, Queen Miska, has decided to disband the royal servant clan in favor of strengthening our skills in the coming movement. Each of you will be assigned a new trait, if you do not have one to strengthen already. Burkhall, you're being assigned to medical under Miss Tell, by Queen Miska's personal request. The other rodents looked to the once orphan young Burkhall, who turned shyly from the attention. As to the rest of you, form a line outside the tent, and we'll decide where you'll be placed for the next 3 months. Radsum pushed up his spectacles and walked towards Burkhall, producing a letter stamped with gold lettering. Young pup, I trust you know where medical is. Burkhall nodded and walked out of the tent, giving a bit of a pleading glance to Rogart as he did so. The rest of the servants followed suit. As Rogart exited, he felt a tug on his blazer. Rogart, I'm kind of nervous. Why do you think the Queen requested me? Rogart gave a small wry smile to the youth. I could think of a few reasons. Burkhall felt his cheeks growing hot. You have been helping out Miss Tell and the Queen a lot. I'm sure you've proved some kind of aptitude, and that's why you've been assigned there. Don't read too much into it. He gave a wink and went to the back of the line. It went quickly enough. He knew many of the other servants to have had trades before coming into service of the royal family. He was an exception, being the most unskilled of the patchwork name of nobles who served the court. He was well educated and had some skill with a blade, but was hardly any kind of warrior. Most would argue that heroics weren't expected of a pup, but hiding while the rest of his family was slaughtered hardly amounted to deserving of life. If anything, his servitude of the usurping family was no more than an insult to the injury sustained of a youth who lost everything. He was a servant, and his skills really didn't amount to much more than that. Next, Radsum said through the flaps of the tent. How many more, Rogart? I'm the last one. Good. I was running out of allotted slots. First off, do you have any kind of skill outside of the servant clan? Radsum had known Rogart most of his life, and knew very well there wasn't much to that orphan he found outside the castle walls, feeding on the discarded scraps so many years ago. No, sir. I've only lived to serve. The old rat let his spectacles ride down his face as he looked down to the piece of parchment in front of him. I'm going to send you to the Claw clan. Maybe toughen you up a bit, boy. Rogart's ears dropped a bit. I'm not so sure I'm suited for... Listen, like it or not, we're at war, Rogart. Your home, our home, is gone. We're rebuilding, and everyone needs to pull their weight. Rogart put his hands up defensively. I'll do my best, sir. Ransom adjusted his spectacles and glared deeply at him. The old man always knew how to shape them up. Rogart stood up straight and rendered the traditional salute, a paw over the chest, signifying loyalty to the clan. Now that that's settled, let's head out. Ransom knelt down and dug into a large wooden trunk behind him, producing an ornate short sword and a well-cared-for bronze chestplate. He put it on and smiled back to Rogart. Shall we be off? Rogart stood in disbelief, looking over at the old rodent. He wore the armor as if he had had it his entire life, but Rogart only knew him as the servant quarters master, not a warrior of any kind. They walked to the far side of the township where a training field for the small fighting force of Sorrel, along with the warriors of mischief. They had a sparring pit of sorts set up, and a small black rodent just entered, dressed heavily in steel plate and a claymore twice his size. The second combatant was a well-muscled brown and white rodent. He entered with nothing save loose leggings. The two sides were backed by the two clans, and this was obviously a little more than just a training session. I get that you big city rats think you're all that, but coming at a combat veteran of Sorrel like myself with no arms or armor is just plain suicide. Ransom smiled back to Rogart and clasped a hand on his shoulder. Recognize him? Rogart looked at the two combatants. I don't believe so. That's Tenzo, one of the temple's masters. The only known to have survived the final attack. Tenzo, the brown and white rat, went to his knees in the center of the field and held his arms out to either side as if surrendering. The crowd went into an uproar. Get up, Melon! The guy's gone spastic from being away from home too long! Mischief's side roared. What are you doing? Don't let him attack you! Come on, you idiot! Malin, the black rodent, took a few labored steps forward, raising the massive blade above his head. Don't say I didn't warn you. No wonder you guys lost. The entirety of the crowd grew silent as a swift arc of the claymore came plunging towards Tenzo's head. It looked as though it cut into the top of it, but stopped just short of striking. Two brown and white hands clasped the blade and held it without so much as a shake from the force of the other combatant. Tenzo yanked the blade behind his head, unbalancing Malin, and then shifted his feet with impossible grace from beneath him, sweeping the other onto his back. Tenzo stood and turned without so much as a word before both sides went into an uproar at the spectacle. Malin struggled, but couldn't manage to overturn the bulk of his armor and embarrassed himself trying to wiggle back up. Eventually, some of Sorrel's side came over and helped him to his feet. Rogart looked to Ransom, who had a triumphant smile on his face. Looks like he still has it. They continued forward and eventually found themselves around the sparring pit, warriors on either side eagerly awaiting their turn to prove themselves the better. It was clear that the majority of the wins went to Mischief's force. Ransom explained that due to the many years of war with the humans, it was easy to surmise that Sorrel was woefully outmatched compared to the experience in warfare Mischief's warriors ascertained. After a few more bouts, the fighting died down and a spit was set up center field. The largest hog Rogart had ever seen was brought center point, and rodents of both sides aided in setting it up for a roast. Ransom tugged Rogart and they went over to Tenzo, who smiled in recognition of Ransom and lifted him up, breastplate and all. It's good to see you, Sammy. Glad you made it out. Once Ransom had re-situated himself, he smiled broadly. You as well, Tenzo, terror of the gentle fist. Ah, and who's this? He said, holding out a paw to shake in front of Rogart. Rogart Patchwork, sir, prior servant to the royal family. A firm shake took his, and Tenzo gave a broad smile. A pleasure. I'm guessing you came to train. Ransom interrupted. I'm having him join the Claw clan to toughen him up a bit. Rogart winced a little, embarrassed at how underprepared he was to be in the presence of warriors. Glad to hear it. New Mischief will need as many able combatants as possible, especially if we ever want to take back our home. I'll introduce you to Lane later. He's in charge of the new recruits, but for now, I think the hog is done. Let's have some, shall we? Mead and meat were passed around for all, and despite the rivalry from earlier, everyone basked in the revelry together. It lasted into the early hours of the morn, where most simply passed out in the grass under the comfort of the fire in good company. A bugle blast sounded, and Rogart opened his eyes to a black rodent standing just over him. "Time to get to work, recruit." He spent the better part of what should have been breakfast hour, running around a field and doing various team-based exercises with many of the other warriors. He wasn't much for strenuous training, and it showed. He quickly came to learn that the new rodent was the infamous Sergeant Lane Tenzo had spoken about. The final exercise turned into another rivalry game, where they were led to several oak logs and broken up into 4 groups, 2 for mischief and 2 for Sorrel. "Get that log above your heads! No weak sisters here!" Each of them strained against it as they ran forward carrying this large oak trunk that must have weighed upward of a ton. They pushed and pushed, not knowing just how far they needed to go. Initially they held the lead, but gradually slowed as the burden became more and more unbearable. "You drop it, and I drop you." Rogart's arms shook, and his legs gave way beneath him as they crested a small hill. Get up, now! Now!" Rogart's chest heaved as Lane screamed at him through a wooden cone that amplified his voice. The other rodents were told to drop the log and repeatedly did other exercises, each pleading that Rogart rejoin them. The other mischief team, along with the Sorrel team, passed by them. Rogart felt his world spin as he did his best to get back on his feet, only to fall forward once more. "All right, right down. Get him strapped to that log. Looks like the load just got heavier." Shame filled his heart as Rogart heard his comrades below him struggle forward. They ached and groaned under his burden. "Let me down. I want to help. His pleas were drowned out by the tenacity of his comrades' efforts and the continual encouragement of Sergeant Lane imparted. A long 10 minutes, and the exercise was finished. All of them lay around the log exhausted, Rogart still strapped atop. "Good work. I want all you to remember this, villain. Movement is life in war. When you stop moving, you die." A few minutes passed, and most of the crew managed to pull themselves back to their feet. "You're a burden, Rogart. A failure. Do you want to get everyone killed because you weren't strong enough? 'Cause your will wasn't steadfast?" The shame was crushing. Rogart wanted to run, but a strong hand found his back, and 2 other rats stood by his side. Lane gave what must have been a semblance of a small smile. "All right. One of our little sisters still hasn't come home. What say you pups get out there and bring 'em home for me?" More of the team began to get to their feet. "I'll expect you to burden the most, Rogart. Show me you have what it takes." They all stood and ran off towards the tree line in what felt like a freeing sprint to find the final Sorrelian team that hadn't made it back. They found them in a clearing where most were lounging about, their backs to trees, and one rodent sat injured, cradling a mangled foot. There was only a single rodent attending him. Without a word, Rogart's team ran to the side of the remaining log, and 3 broke off to pick up the injured. "Let's get him home!" Lane's booming voice from behind them called. The injured one was strapped to the log much like Rogart was initially, and they hoisted it with a Herculean effort. Some of the Sorrelians helped while the others looked in shame as the log was taken back to camp. It wasn't much, but Rogart felt he had somewhat redeemed himself as he headed the final log in. There were some claps, and all wearily sat awaiting next instruction. Lane went to the head of the large group and conversed with a Sorrelian leader. They broke off and were told to head to a mess hall to get a well-deserved meal. The meal presented definitely symbolized the hard times that had fell upon the land. Rations of beans, bread, a cup of milk, and a small wedge of cheese to top off the banquet. Radsam and Tenzo ate at the head of the hall, beside Lane and the other Sorrelian officer. Rogart sat flanked by his many logmates who regaled the table with their battles and heroics of the war before having to flee mischief. "This big fella, at least 7 feet, raises his mace up, right, and I's duck under, catching his little finger with me dagger. Man squeals louder than me fat uncle at the mention of a tabaxi." The table begins laughing hysterically. "How about you, Rogart? What were you up to?" "I, was a servant for the royal family." He felt his face flush a bit, embarrassed, given that the position was fairly coveted by the common folk of mischief. "Ah, one of the silver spoon types, eh? No worries. I saw the way you blew chunks. I know you did your best. Surprised you made it that far, honestly. Not a muscle on you. The table began to laugh heartily again. They were interrupted by Ling calling to meet back out in the field for some after-meal exercise. The tables leapt up and hustled back, many enthusiastically ready to jump into the sparring pit once more. They broke off as they were found before, Sorrel to one side and Mischief the other. Both sides began to jeer as combatants from each stepped forward. Let's get some new blood in there. Rogart, you're up. Sergeant Lane sent him forward with a shove, and a familiar, ornate-looking short sword was thrown next to him. He looked back to see Radsome stoically gazing forward. Send someone easy, boys. He's no warrior. A lanky-looking rodent was pushed forward from Sorrel's side. He quickly lost his footing and went down snout first, sending his spectacles flying forward into the field. His notebook and quill were beside him, visibly ruined from toppling onto the ground. Go on, Doppler, show him what for. The Sorrelians cheered as the lanky rat pulled himself up after fumbling about for his glasses. A small double-headed axe wedged itself into the ground beside him, causing him to flinch forward. He raised his head up to Rogart with what looked like absolute pleading eyes. Rogart picked up the short sword and shakingly raised it in front of him, desperately trying to recall the few childhood lessons he had with his uncle, who once headed the Royal Guard. The lanky rat pulled at the handle of the axe twice before managing to free it from the earth, and held it out to the side of him, gripped in both hands, practically dragging it forward. The two rodents stood 5 feet from one another before a whistle blast signified the fight to start. Rogart poised the blade for a lunging strike. His uncle had told him that it was difficult to block and gave more reach to the wielder. He stepped through, increasing his reach to the best of his ability, only to fall short a foot from the other rodent. The lanky one let out a whimper and painstakingly tried to move the axe in a great effort to knock Rogart's blade away. It managed to connect, and the noise of steel on steel riled up the crowd once more. Rogart recovered his posture, as did his foe, who backed away quickly to create more distance. Rogart began tracing a leg behind him to ready for another lunge, but instead managed to catch his own tail and fell backward onto the ground. Seizing the moment, the lanky one closed the distance and attempted a haymaker of sorts. Using the momentum of the axe, he twisted his body as would a miner raising a pickaxe and swung forward. Unfortunately for him, he didn't see Rogart's leg and toppled on top of him as Rogart attempted to move away from his strike. Rogart grabbed the half of the axe and tucked it under his arm, locking it in place. His own blade was beneath the small of his back, and he wouldn't be able to move it while weighed down. Quit making out with each other and fight! The crowd poured insult after insult as the two struggled against one another. Rogart reared a paw back and punched him in the face, sending his glasses flying. The lanky one returned the favor, connecting a strike with Rogart's face, drawing blood from his snout. They exchanged a few more weak blows until the whistle blasted, signaling the end of combat. The two were pulled to their feet, hands slapping their backs as they were pulled to their respective sides. Now, the piece de resistance. Radsome stepped forward, picking up his blade, and a Sorrelian officer that had sat beside him at lunch did so in kind. First blood, then, Radsome said, rolling his shoulders forward. The opponent picked up a large halberd and held it steady in front of him, and nodded as he psyched himself up for battle. The whistle sounded, and the officer charged forward with a resounding war cry. Radsome stood, unfazed, and held his short sword to his side. The halberd was thrust forward with a practiced, perfect momentum that was well received in its own right. However, it was pushed ever so slightly off kilter and grazed Radsome's breastplate. The distance was closed quickly, and Radsome made a brilliant swing towards the exposed gap of the plating on the officer, but did not connect as the halberd's momentum was shifted, forcing Radsome to lunge forward and attempt a sweep maneuver from behind the officer. The Sorrelian lifted a leg in anticipation and managed to avoid losing his footing, but lost the momentum of his swing. Rogart would have swore he saw a smile on the old rat's face, as Radsome threw his weight into the officer, dropping his blade in the process to complete a single-leg takedown. He was quickly mounted and began raining blows onto him until a whistle sounded, freeing him from his battle rage. Radsome pulled the Sorrelian officer to his feet, and the two of them glared at one another a moment before nodding and turning to pick up their respective weapons. After a few more competition-fueled matches, the day finished, and they went to eat once more. The menu this time consisted of a baked potato, a single large head of broccoli, and thin slices of beef. Not a bad lunch, Rogart. You need a little more aggression, but you really got into it towards the end there. Rogart felt his cheeks grow red. He had only managed to embarrass himself yet again. The halls were abuzz with laughter and merriment once more, until about halfway through the meal, a doe (female rodent) dressed in dark leathers walked through the double doors. The atmosphere almost immediately grew thick, the kind of feeling one gets when a predator stalks its prey in plain sight. Some of the most seasoned of warriors, laughing only moments ago, now stared directly at the trays in front of them. Rogart could feel it. She was definitely watching him. She wanted him dead. A sense of dread overtook him as each of her footsteps brought her closer. His heart began racing as she continued. The sweat beneath his fur grew ice cold as the rhythm of the footsteps broke for the slightest of moments just behind him before continuing forward. He took in another deep breath as she passed and chanced a glance. He immediately regretted it. His hairs immediately stood on end, and his stomach turned sour. Her cape held a veritable litany of distorted human faces, tanned, blackened, stretched, and stitched. Every step she took seemed to make the mouths and eyes move, and a palpable fear overtook him. He began to breathe frantically as a chorus of howls and moans of despair drowned out the intense silence. He wanted to run. He needed to. A hand touched his shoulder, and a wave of calm washed over him. "It's all right, lad. That cape Nels wears, it's enchanted, see? Brings fear of God in any living creature looks at it." "I think she was staring at me. I could feel it." The veteran put a finger up to his own lip. "That's the heart of a cold-blooded killer. We all feel it." Even Lane seemed off-put as she stood in front of the head table and reached into her belt to produce a small wrinkled envelope. "Rogart, Shilir, front and center." Rogart felt his heart sink into an ice-cold ocean that flooded his entire being. "Rogart, Shilir!" the voice called again. His arms were visibly shaking, and his legs felt like flaccid noodles as he pulled himself up. His eyes were glued to the floor as he turned towards the head table. He had taken only a step when he saw it, the horrid cape just entering his field of vision. He let out an involuntary scream and looked up paralyzed in fear at the doe who now stood beside him. Her fur was black, hooded, a dark face and a white fur peeking out through the bit of exposed stomach in her armor. There was a single ornate curved dagger at her side with the image of a rat carved into the pommel. As his eyes met two pools of liquid starlight, Rogart knew he was going to die. She gave a playful smirk, walking past and traced a sharp nail down his spine, all the way to the base of his tail, before continuing the same rhythmic pace at which she had entered. He hurriedly walked forward to his summons. A rat of medium build dressed in half-plate stood shaking in front of the main table. Ransom held the letter out in front of him. "Looks like the two of you just got conscripted to work with the scouting corps." Rogart went to take the letter, but Ransom held tight. "Listen, this is an opportunity. Make the most of it, and above all else, watch your back out there." "I don't—" Ransom let the parchment go and procured another, handing it to Shilir. "Lady Nell will be waiting for you. Look out for one another, and good luck." He turned his attention to Lane, and left the two of them standing, shaken from their encounter only moments ago. Shilir turned first, and walked with the pace of the dead towards the front. Ransom didn't pay Rogart another look. It felt as if there was a large lead ball dragging behind him as he turned to follow Shilir. They reached the double doors and opened them to two rats standing in wait, fully dressed in brown leather armor. One was missing the better part of his left ear, and the other wore a cloth that concealed all but a set of forest green eyes.
"Ah, finally got us some new blood. Looks like Nell already got to you. You'll get used to her. Name's Tom, by the way." He extended a hand and reached forward, pulling Rogart into his grasp. "Don't mind Molly. She fancies herself an up-and-coming badass like Nell." The hooded doe looked upward, eyes furrowed with indignation at the accusation. "Let's get you both kitted up. You'll be on your first mission tonight." Although enervation coursed through both of their bodies, having trained all day, fear and anxiety dominated. The mere mention of Nell's name brought back harrowing thoughts of her sickly cape and predatorial playfulness. Shilir posed the question both of them dreaded the answer to. Will Nell be joining us? The mostly concealed escort let out a small chuckle, leaving Rogart feeling a bit more embarrassed than he would have liked. No, she wouldn't waste her time on something so trivial, but I wouldn't put it past her to stalk or scry on us. What do you mean by scry? Rogart said. It's a kind of magic. Lets you watch folks even when you're not with them. You don't always know it. It's like the boogeyman in the closet. Tam motioned, and the four of them began forward. Don't worry yourselves too much about it. She rarely deems anyone completely incompetent. Unless you count Jasper, Reginald, Edward, Yoshlim, Trevor, Crispin. A long pause and stare-off between Sam and Molly commenced. Should I go on, Tam? He turned his head away with a quick jerk and began pacing forward. You don't have to go and scare everyone you meet, Molly. Crispin didn't follow the code. Molly removed her mask and scampered on fours to quickly halt Tam's advance. He sacrificed himself for us, and I won't let you tarnish his good name. Wouldn't say that about Nell, though, would you, Moll? Tension rose quickly between the two. Rogart and Shylear gave side-eye glances at one another as they looked onto what felt like a lit powder keg. Molly continued staring him down until a voice gave every last one of them a start. Wouldn't say what, exactly? Rogart felt his hairs go on end as Nell's voice carried over them. Molly and Tam began searching carefully with their eyes and stopped over Rogart where they stayed transfixed. A sharp claw traced his spine, and a voice came again. Molly, it's okay. I promise I won't be angry. Rogart was overcome with a sense of helplessness. She could kill him any time she wished, and he knew it. Every fiber of his being told him to run, get away, anything. Well, you see, Crispin, The claw bit deeper into Rogart's back, causing him to wince involuntarily. Little Crispin, yes, I remember him. In a blur of reality, the looming death Rogart felt vanished, and Nell now stood looking down at Molly. There was about a head's difference. Nell no longer wore the cape of flesh, but stood clad in her shadowed leather, the small of her muscular back exposed, revealing a core of white fur with a trace of black that extended from her head fading into it. Molly took in what felt like a visible gulp of air, attempting to steady herself. He sacrificed himself for us. Nell looked amused, and sat on a seemingly invisible stool, her legs crossing, and paw tucked under her chin, as if pondering. So I've been told before, but it seems as though there's more to tell. There was another pause. Molly clearly shook up, looked everywhere but directly in front of her. Well, if there's nothing more you wish to say, she stood up, gave some small glance to Rogart, and walked into the alleyway of a nearby building, disappearing into the shadows. The air lightened noticeably, and Molly stood with the smallest hint of moisture accumulating beneath her eyes. This was the first time Rogart had been able to actually see her. Beyond those vibrant green eyes, she had beautiful facial features to match, and a toasty almond fur that had a sheen even in the dim moonlight. They walked in as evening gave way to the dark hours. Tam stepped forward and grabbed her arm. Sorry, Moll. Let's go get her damn pet and be done with it. The four of them walked in silence, stopping in front of a small building that looked worse for wear, and a rusted metal door further still. The hinges creaked loudly and threatened to break off as it swung outward, revealing a second black door seemingly of wrought iron. Tam gave a knock, and the door almost seemed to howl as with the wind passing through the forest. The last summer was rainy. An audible click echoed through the night air. The door swinging open welcomed them inside. The inside proved in far better condition than the exterior. The walls were smooth slate set with black iron fixtures, and many oddities hung on the walls of the room. A small alcove towards the back held a kitchen-like area set with fruits and a small wood range. I'll get us some rations packed, and maybe a little something. You too hungry? Rogart realized that he hadn't the chance to finish the majority of his meal before he was so eloquently ousted. The knots in his stomach had finally come undone, finding some solace in this fairly cozy den. I wouldn't mind something to eat, thank you. Tam gave a nod and headed back into the kitchen area, turning a corner and opening another door hidden from sight. Why don't you start fitting their leathers more? She turned to the two of them and motioned with her head to follow. Rogart glanced about the countless bric-a-brac lining the walls. There were pocket watches, broken blades, books and photos, a dented helmet, a curious shield with a bust of a pig at its center. A painting of a doe with infinitely black fur set on a velvet and gold background stopped his musings. Once Rogart's eyes met it, he couldn't help but stare at it. The painting almost seemed to call to him. He walked in front of it and stopped himself just short of touching it, when a familiar voice called out to him. "Quit your staring, Rogart. She isn't going anywhere," Molly said, opening a door he somehow had missed upon his cursory glance of the room. A small arc of flame lit the sconces, illuminating a series of oaken chests and a small black book on a pedestal a bit further along the way. "Do either of you have any experience with light armor?" She looked to Shylir. "You'll need to ditch the breastplate. It'll be burdensome for climbing, escape, and probably give us away even if we shattered it." Shylir nodded in affirmation and began unclasping the leather straps. She walked over to the first chest and threw open its lid. "Well, come on." And she proceeded to step backward into the trunk, climbing down until she disappeared from sight. The two of them glanced at one another, and then back at the trunk, which seemed ordinary enough. Rogart was the first to walk to its side and peer down. The top rung of the ladder, embedded into the wood, seemingly went on for all of his perceivable distance. It certainly wasn't the easiest of things to trust, as the metal rung creaked loudly against his weight. There was a large circular room with oak walls and beds at the bottom of the chest. A single door, close to the ladder, was open. He stepped forward to see Molly digging through an exotic-looking wardrobe towards the back. "Let's see here. Boots, chaps, belt, braces." She turned as he entered. "Stop putting that on." Rogart did his best, but he was fairly unfamiliar with the many pieces, and some of them didn't seem to fit at all. The chest piece, in particular, stopped short of his stomach, and he heard a small chuckle. A hand took his, and he felt a sharp pinch causing him to yelp. A firm grip guided his hand to the armor, and it slid down and tightened itself around him, as if it were made the perfect fit. He babied his paw a moment, placing a bleeding finger into his mouth. "It's a bit stronger than normal. Wear it well. It was a cherished comrade." An intricately carved oak tree with branches that seamlessly flowed into blossoming vines covered the armor. The center of it was red with his very own blood. Shylir made it by this point, and was given a more beaten-looking set of leathers. A faint odor of charred flesh hung about it, and the leather itself looked as though it were burned black. "Why do I get the smelly armor and you get a masterpiece?" Shylir said, pointing at Rogart, a bit of jealousy tracing his voice. Molly stopped rummaging, turned, and stood up, her face looking downward at their feet. "Rogart, stand behind me." He did so, and Shylir looked wide-eyed, feeling a building intensity, and getting the feeling he may have been too hasty to speak so freely. A grape-sized orb expanded into a large melon-sized inferno beneath Molly's hand. The heat caused Rogart to fall rearward into the wardrobe. She raised it in front of her, and threw it just as Shylir attempted to dodge out of the doorway. It hit him square in the back, sending him flying the better part of the way across the room, where he lay face down, scorch marks surrounding his body. Rogart ran over to him to inspect him. The armor looked no worse for wear, although the exposed fur of his head and upper arms were singed considerably. "Without that armor, you'd be dead. Don't forget that." She stepped over and passed a hand along Shylir, a faint light overtaking him. He pulled himself up and didn't say another word. They were given a dagger and some rope, along with a glowing stone to place in their pouch before heading back up. The second Rogart exited the trunk, a pleasant aroma of bacon filled the room. A small table was in the center, holding a decent bit of meat, along with appetizing sides that made their soldier rations from earlier look like a poorly scraped-together trash run. "Sorry, guess I got a little carried away. Looks like you might have too," he said, glancing at Shylir, who sat at a table and greedily guzzled a tankard. They enjoyed the well-prepared food, Tam profusely apologizing for the meat being a little salty. Consequence of the preservative, I'm afraid. After a moment of light-hearted banter, Tam began explaining just what they would be doing. "Nell has this lizard, right? Calls it Scaly. Poor bastard unsurprisingly tries to run away from her. She doesn't restrain it or anything. Never locks the door, so we have to go find it damn near every week when it manages to work up the courage to run.
I'm not sure I follow. Why doesn't she just cage the thing? Tam and Molly both sighed.
Makes good practice, she says. Keeps our skills sharp. They finished their meal, getting a quick rundown on possible locations and the nature of the stones Molly gave them earlier. Those are fragments of meteorite, shaved and enchanted to communicate with one another. As long as you have a piece, we'll be able to keep in contact within 20 kilometers. Luckily, the little bastard never makes it far, even if she did wait 3 days to tell us this time. We'll split up. I'll take Shylere, and Maul will go with Rogart. Check the Cyrene mine. He pointed to a small area of a map now sprawled across the center of the table. Tam walked back to the kitchen area and returned with 4 tightly bound bundles. A ration each should do us fine. Let's hurry back. I've got a dinner date tomorrow. They split up, each heading to the opposite sides of the settlement. They stopped just short of a small tree line. All right, Rogart, you lead from here. Rogart looked back, a bit of disbelief overcoming him. I haven't the faintest idea how to get to the mine. She patted a pouch on her side and nodded to him. He reached down into a small satchel on his side with the expectation of finding a map sticking out of it. Instead, it held nothing. Literally, he couldn't even see the fabric of the inside. Just reach in and pull out the damn map. He hesitantly reached in and found that he could keep going further and further until his flexibility gave no more. You have to actively want to find it, Rogart. He thought about the map and felt the dry texture of parchment rub against his fingers. He unfurled it, and they were off. It was a full 2 hours of constant chastising from his partner, who would tell him where to go, but sigh every time he decided on a direction. Nevertheless, the experience was quite exciting for some reason. He felt alive exploring the forestland in search of this Cyrene mine. It was a wonder he wasn't exhausted given the long chain of events and training that took place for the day. After he ate, all of his energy and some just seemed to come back to him. They started the ascent of a small hillside when Molly threw an arm up and opened a line of telepathy. Tam, I'm getting a reading. Some kind of magical artifact about 3 kilometers west of the mine. Another voice invaded Rogart's headspace. Copy that. 3? You should have been there a while ago. The equivalent of a telepathic sigh was perceived. Rogart isn't very skilled with orienteering. Rogart could feel Tam laughing at him despite the great distance they were from one another. Anyway, don't engage. It's probably a band of humans. Bounty hunters for the king's bounty on the rat folk. She started up the hill, giving a quick glance back to Rogart. He said not to. We're scouts, you dope. We're going to look. They crested the hill and crawled through the brush. There were 3 figures in view, a tall cat creature, a smaller white cat creature with a bow beside her, and a curious human with sharp ears and white hair. The man and white cat slept close to one another, while the taller one sat on a nearby log, carving into something with a dagger. Stay silent while I have a closer look, all right? She said to Rogart with telepathy. Another voice responded. You know I've already seen the 2 of you, right? She quickly jerked back to the large cat, who was still whittling away without so much as a glance in their direction. A hand went to her side to find the handle of her dagger. I wouldn't bother if I were you, a voice said, condemning the action as a click was heard behind them. There was no longer a figure sitting on the log, only the 2 sleeping forms of a gray human and a white cat. Molly quickly sprang to action, Rogart clumsily turning behind him only to see air. He turned his head back to see the large cat standing in front of them, with a small silver weapon of tubes trained on Molly. Killing the 2 of you would be child's play. I suggest you start talking. Molly stared a long moment at him before resheathing her dagger. The trained weapon lowered in kind, and the tabaxi took on a carefree posture. Actually, I really just want to know where to find the Starflower Visitor. It wasn't unfamiliar to her. They were hard to find because they hid underground until the night of a clear, waning crescent, before blooming for a few short hours. She had seen them near the mine once, actually, but she certainly didn't want him anywhere near their destination. You're not bounty hunters, then? She said cautiously. If hunting flowers were a bounty, sure. She reached into her pouch, slowly producing a map. They grow around this area, pointing to an area far from their destination, and only during the crescent moon for a few short hours. He reached out and gently took hold of her hand, and then guided it to the mine.
I believe you meant here. She immediately began to feel the heat of being caught in her deception. Thank you for the information. And he faded with a gust of air, and once more sat whittling away with his dagger off in the distance. She was a bit shaken by the experience, and Rogart was at a loss for words. We're still heading to the mines. Come on. The confidence in her voice was gone, and she relayed the situation to Tam via the stone. Stay put, Moll. We'll regroup, and then head together. The sun had begun rising, and by the time they arrived, Shailir looked fairly pleased with himself, pocketing the map. Rat's got a talent for reading a map, I'll give him that, Tam said. Better be off then. Still need to get back before evening. Nature reclaimed the mine long ago. Its entrance was veritably hidden away behind the overgrowth. There were footprints stamped into the dirt at its entrance. Found him, Molly said, glancing back at Tam. She picked up some loose rocks she had found at the entrance and imbued them with a faint glow that gave some light to the pitch-black cavern. It glistened off of the accumulated moisture lining the walls, and almost gave the appearance of an otherworldly quality to the earthen hallways. They had Shailir and Rogart head the search, pointing out different clues giving hint to where their quarry most likely went. See this? Molly said. He isn't an idiot. This is fake. He's trying to make us think he went this way. But if we look closely, you can see where the tail dragged down. Further they went into the belly, and soon they saw an abundance of light peeking through an archway off some distance. Wait here a minute. Tam stepped forward and stopped about midway, bending down and pulling something from his pouch. A few moments later there was a loud clink, and he jumped back nervously. That was a close one. See that? He said, pointing to a seemingly ordinary pile of rocks. Nasty piece of work. He went to his knees again, pulling out his tools, and eventually held up what looked like a small red orb. Blast trap. I doubt Skelly set this up. We need to be cautious. He got to his feet and started down the hallway once more. Looks like a door. Don't remember this being down here. Come on. They started forward, and just as Tam came into view, the door opened and 4 hands grabbed him and dragged him through. Tam! Molly yelled, rushing forward with a hand instinctively reaching for her dagger. She closed the distance quickly, but the door slammed just before she made it. Rogart and Shailir stopped just shy of her as she empowered a large orb of flame and threw it forward, blowing the door completely out of its frame and loosing a good deal of rubble. 2 men armed with a spear and a longsword poised for combat, while another held Tam to the ground by the scruff, with a dagger placed against the soft side of his throat. Looks like the lizard was right. Can't wait to count the coin the king will have for us. Molly quickly created another ball of energy, but was stopped short of casting it when the spear flew directly at her, forcing her to dodge out of the way. The man pulled a sword and stepped forward, swinging it down at Rogart, who fumbled to produce his own blade. The steel was inches from his skull when he felt a force knock him back. The armor glowed a faint green color, and the man in front of him recovered posture and made to swing at him again, narrowly missing his head. It grazed Rogart's own shoulder and sent a splatter of blood across the back wall. Molly managed to backstab him before the other managed to move in and wrestle her to the ground. He began bashing the back of her head repeatedly with the pommel of his blade, his own weight pressing her down, preventing escape, until after the 4th blow she went limp. Rogart yelled in frustration and thrust his dagger forward, but was parried by the man's steel vambrace, deflecting it and exposing Rogart's core. The man pushed off of the unconscious doe and delivered a devastating hook that caused Rogart to curl into a ball as it felt all of his lower ribs had shattered at once. Rogart felt him towering over, raising his blade to deliver the coup de grace, but it never came. Instead, he heard a large clink as the figure toppled over. Tam pulled him to his feet and looked over with a sullen look at the corpse of Shailir that lay with a dagger sticking from his left eye. He walked over to Molly and caressed the back of her head, a faint glow surrounding his hand. Vicious injury. She won't be waking up any time soon. God damn them! Why did this war ever happen in the first place? Rogart felt worthless. He had only managed to get in the way. If it weren't for whatever his armor had done, he would have ended up just like Shailir, dead. A loud blast sent them both on alert. Rogart recognized the form of the tabaxi from earlier, walking forward with a human woman over one shoulder and a large sack. Don't come any closer, Tam said. The cat stopped and threw the woman's corpse and a now squirming sack onto the ground. Very well. A favor begets a favor. At least that's what I tell myself. I believe you came in search of this one. He turned and began walking back out. Tam cautiously walked forward and heaved the sack over his shoulder, dragging it back. Jeez, this thing weighs a ton. Pulling his dagger, he cut the rope binding the sack, and its soft walls fell, revealing a kobold swinging wildly at the air. He was bruised and battered, one eye swollen shut, and marks of continual tears stained his face. Calm down, Skelly, it's us. The creature only stopped, looked over, staring to Tam before sinking down and burying its face in despair. Rogart immediately recognized the creature. It was a kobold. They were common enough near Mischief, but it made sense the Sorrelians that lived in open air wouldn't have been familiar with the race. This one was a little different, though, seemed more feral for some reason. Looks like we found him. Nell'll be pissed we let one of our recruits die. Rogart collapsed to his bottom and stared at Skelly. There was another form just beside him. It looked like another one. Female, at least by the looks of her, Tam said, reaching as if to more closely examine her. Skelly sprang to life, hissing, only to meet Tam's fist, which cold-cocked him into the realm of sleep. Oh boy, sorry Skelly, reflex. Shouldn't go doing that. He looked over to Rogart. Got us a right shit show, don't we? He began laughing of all things. Rogart couldn't wrap his head around it. They were surrounded by corpses, one of them their comrade, and he was laughing. Help me check the bodies. We'll burn 'em, then make camp for a spell. Far from enjoying it, Rogart rifled through the pockets of the dead, stripping valuable bits and looking specifically for any kind of intel. They managed 3 gold, 20 silver, and a parchment of bounty for ratfolk hides, promising up to a gold for each skin depending on the condition. They burned the bodies, Shylere included, and buried the remaining ash along with the equipment they wouldn't be able to carry. All the same in the long run. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Tam decided it would be too cumbersome to carry both Skelly and Molly, so they decided to tough it out until she recovered enough to get home of her own accord. Felicia's gonna kill me. Rogart was tasked with tending to the unconscious Molly, while Tam saw to their food and water shortage. Tam was an accomplished hunter, so despite their short rations, they ate fairly well. This also gave ample opportunity for Rogart to receive much-needed training in his copious free time. You have to steady your breathing. See there? Your shots keep pulling left because you're anticipating a snap. Just let it happen. Rogart had next to zero experience with a bow, and the string whipped his arm raw from the hours of practice he put into learning it. Towards the middle of the second day, Tam had gone back out to scout the area for humans that may have come for their comrades. Rogart looked to the kobold caged in a small crate the humans had brought presumably for any sorry creature they decided not to kill outright. He was curled tightly, and had begun to recover for the most part. He looked up lazily as Rogart approached. What clan do you hail from, Skelly? The kobold opened its mouth as if to say something, but looked away after a quick moment of contemplation. I had a friend named Yantir when I was a pup. He was from the Thresher clan. Rogart gave a small semblance of a smile at the memory. He wasn't able to stay long after the war started, and Mischief closed the city down. Have you heard of it?
Yes.
Just as Rogart thought he was speaking to the air, the creature replied to him.
Clan Thesser, Clan Marnak's ally. Moonclaw Thresher Clan.
Skelly's claws wrapped tightly around a small pendant that had been seen on the other kobold's neck. It was a large animal incisor. Yantir always boasted he would find the biggest of them all for his trial. Why do you speak like that, Skelly? I've known plenty of kobold diplomats, and even the kobold language isn't so, well, primitive.
Not Skelly, Alatar.
My apologies, Alatar.
Rat Lady take Alatar. Threatens darkness. No darkness, please. Gives medicine. Medicine bad. Confused. Makes tired.
That'll be enough of that, Rogart, Tam said, walking back in. Don't go messing around with Nell's pet, or we'll all regret it. Tam, I grew up with kobolds. They aren't pets. They had ambassadors for Nim's sake. Tam sighed. I don't want to know any of this. I'm going back, giving Nell her Skelly, and finding Thalissa for some quality time. His name is Alatar, Tam. Nell did something to him. They aren't stupid. He's been made spastic. Tam raised a hand. Stop, Rogart.
As soon as Maul's awake, we're leaving, and Skelly's going back where he belongs. I won't hear any more of it. Let's get us some soup going.
After tending to Molly, Rogart decided he wouldn't stand for it. I'm taking Skelly to the bathroom. Tam gave him a look of condemnation.
Remember what I said. We're here to bring her pet home. This isn't a damn rescue mission.
Rogart opened the cage, grabbed the rope to tie around Alatar's neck, and exited. The second they reached the open air, Rogart pulled his dagger and cut the rope free. Go on, Alatar. You deserve better than this. The kobold didn't move, only stared at the ground before sinking to his knees.
No more Moonclaw.
His claws wrapped around the tooth pendant. There are other mates, Alatar. Go home. Go to your clan. The words were out before he realized just how insensitive he was being. I'm sorry, Alatar. I just don't want to see anyone treated like that.
No clan. No home.
He lifted his ragged shirt, revealing a large scar that ran the length of his back. You've been banished, haven't you? Alatar got back to his feet and almost lifelessly went back into the cave. A hand found Rogart's shoulder. Sometimes that's just the way of things. Tam was standing beside him as if he had followed them out there. For a second there, I was worried. But the poor bastard really seems broken this time. They didn't bother closing the cage. There wasn't a need, as the kobold curled in on himself and slept. The next morning, Molly finally awoke. Where are my leathers? She said, glaring at Tam and Rogart. Well, you've been out for 2 days, Mole. It was either we clean you or leave you stewing. Body doesn't just shut down, you know. The bluntness left her embarrassed, and Rogart averted his eyes in the same sentiment. Molly dressed herself and stood a bit weakly. Let's give you a bit of time to recruit. Here. Tam held out a large leg of meat from a kill he scored the night before. By the afternoon, Molly assured them she was ready to journey back, and they were off. They made it back mid-evening, and took the kobold to a door not far from the place Rogart assumed was his new headquarters and home. The door was answered by Nell herself, who dressed in a flowing silk kimono that all but betrayed the terrifying predator he had met before. Oh, wonderful, my little Skelly. She yanked the rope high above her head, strangling the poor creature for a few moments before setting it back down beside her. Rogart swore he could hear the lament of the poor soul, while Molly ushered him away, back towards headquarters. They headed inside, and Tam and Molly lightheartedly argued about who should cook something before the task ultimately was passed to Rogart. Luckily, he was no stranger to the kitchen. He proudly served an array of cultured dishes only the wealthiest of rat folks could have been privy to. Not bad, Rogart. Color me impressed, Molly said, cutting into the massive fish head he prepared as a centerpiece for the meal. 3 glasses of aged wine passed hands, and a toast commenced, led by Molly, to Shylear and the many fallen comrades of previous. After a much-needed bath, Rogart had some of the best sleep of his life. The beds of the hidden trunk were incredibly soft, and welcomed the itis that quickly set in after the meal. They had a special visitor the next day. He had walked up to have some breakfast on his first day off in a very long while, and found Nell waiting for him dressed in her leathers. She sat with a leg crossed, poising a leather-bound book. Finally awake, are we, sleepyhead? Come, sit next to me. He cautiously walked forward and pulled the chair, his anxiety returning to him all at once. I thought I'd get a laugh from this book, but instead I found something a lot more curious. Rogart made himself as comfortable as possible given his nervousness. I'm not sure I could help with title selection. She began to chuckle at his confusion. You don't recognize this? He gave a more studied look at the cover and realized it was the very book his mother had given him. She had taken it from his lodgings in the tower. Rage washed over him. That isn't yours. Give it back. Nell gave a look that told him everything belonged to her, and he cursed his own cowardice as fear quelled the fire to a smoldering ash. The stories in these pages are more than entertainment. In fact, she set the book down, and the air beside her began reverberating with energy, tearing the very fabric of reality enough for her arm to pass through. She pulled it back, holding a ring of solid obsidian. Its emblem appeared faded, but most likely once resembled a wolf's effigy. The cursed ring of Nareth, created from a high demon by the bestial Lord Karan in legends of old. I had my doubts on the object's actual potential, until I read your little book, Rogart. He recalled the story to the best of his ability. It was supposed to be to summon a demon in his service, right? She placed the ring back into the void and sealed it once more. The very same. A building anticipation abated his fear. Did you... She put a hand up. I died a terrible death the day I touched that ring. Perhaps I'll regale you with that story another time. Her lips curved, forming a playful smile. I'm afraid I lied about giving you time off. There's work to be done. She pulled a letter stamped with Mischief's seal. I've informed the Queen of a certain something that may be able to turn the tide in our favor. A missive has been sent to our rodent friend, and it's time to figure out what this game-changing find might be. Like a choice, or comment one of your own ideas. The most liked comment gets it, and the story will progress in that direction. Let's write a story. Let's play a game. Without the dice.